I want to thank our guests for this week for this week's guest lecture. We have Mario Carrillo, who is the campaigns manager for America's Voice. Thank you for being here, Mario.
Thank you for having me, Art. Great to be back.
Before we get to what you do at America's Voice, for this week, my class, we're talking about, or the last few weeks in my class, we've been talking about living on the border. The whole class is leadership on the border.
Sure.
And so I've taken the first few weeks to talk about how unique of a space the border is, specifically, talking about El Paso. And the fact for many people, whether they're immigrants or whether they're citizens, there is like this dual or hybrid identity. I know Gloria Ansaldúa talks about it a lot. So could you just describe your experience growing up in El Paso and living on the border?
Yeah, for sure. So I was born in Chihuahua, and when I was 5, my family decided to migrate, and we settled in El Paso. I joked that they stopped as soon as they crossed the border, and they thought this is good enough. So I feel like for me, having that experience of growing up in El Paso, but still being an immigrant, but still feeling incredibly welcomed by the community is something that I think is probably unique in this country. I only have my own experience, but I feel like having visited a lot of the country, I would imagine that being an immigrant somewhere else is probably significantly more difficult. But I know that growing up in El Paso, my parents, who to this day now, almost 30 years later, still struggle to speak English. They're still not fully able to hold a conversation. They can understand you, but they can get by in El Paso because it's a community that it doesn't denigrate people who speak Spanish, and it welcomes our biculturalism and our bilingualism. So I think it's a unique place in that way. I think it really defined my own way of seeing the world and understanding that, the border is unique, but the rest of the country is not like the border. And honestly, having left El Paso, I went to finish my undergraduate studies in San Antonio, which is still majority Latino, but not as much as El Paso is. And then from there, moving to different parts of the country, you kind of understand like, wow, growing up in El Paso, being a Latino is the norm, and you feel like you're a part of a community that is accepting, that is yours. Whereas I haven't necessarily felt that in other places that I've lived. So I love El Paso. I think it really formed me as a person, and I encourage people to go visit when they can. I think it's such a lovely place still.
Awesome. Now, what is your goal at America's Voice, and what is your specific role with the organization?
Yeah, for sure. So America's Voice came about around 10 years ago, and it started off as like a communications arm for the immigrant rights movement more broadly. And then back then there were some organizations, but certainly not as many as there are now. I think even back in 2010, 2009, it was still kind of in the nascent stages. The initial DREAM Act had been introduced in 2001, and it had gone through ups and downs, and it had gone through failures at that point. So then it was like in the mid 2000s when the Dreamer movement really started taking off, and you had a lot of young immigrants out there sharing their own stories and advocating for themselves. And there were also policy fights and fights in the legislature to try to actually get policies passed through Congress. So I think through then is when America's Voice decided, all right, there are a lot of folks doing great things. How can we ensure that they have more of a voice or more of a role to play in this, and that we invite them to do trainings, to learn the ins and outs of communication, and have them like the basics of writing a press release or us writing press releases on their behalf. So we really wanted to bring the immigrant rights movement to another level of communications capacity. And even within that time, in the last 10 years, some of the work at America's Voice has shifted a bit to do a lot more advocacy for other things beyond just like comprehensive immigration reform. We've had a lot of conversations in terms of what we do to stop deportations, a lot of conversations in terms of what it means to have like increased attention in the country, right? So it became a much broader conversation than just legalizing all the folks who are in the country, but also minimizing the impact and negative effects that immigration policy has as a whole on the community. So I think in that sense, the scope of the work has shifted a bit, but at its core, it does remain to find a permanent and legal solution for folks who are in the country currently undocumented to find an avenue and a pathway to citizenship. And within that now, my work has shifted somewhat from when I first started at America's Voice in 2017. Mm-hmm. I started off as the Texas State Director, which was building partnerships with organizations here in the state that are doing both local advocacy, so trying to get their municipalities to change ordinances in their city to make their cities more welcoming towards immigrants, anything to do with like state policies. So here in Texas in 2017, they passed SB4, which for a lot of us really was a punch in the gut because it's very anti-immigrant. It's not too dissimilar from Arizona's SB 1070 that essentially allowed and almost encouraged any law enforcement official in the state to ask people about their immigration status if they, for one reason or another, thought that they might not be here legally, right? So we fought hard and fought back against that, and now a lot of cities are trying to do that as well. So within my work, initially, it was trying to build partnerships so that those organizations also were able to build capacity and fight back against some of those local ordinances. But now the work has shifted a bit since we don't have a legislative session in Texas this year, and it's really focused on the 2020 election. And what we're trying to do is create and hopefully implement a narrative on immigration in which immigration is like a defining issue that makes people want to vote for candidates that are pro-immigrant, and also equipping candidates themselves, right? Because I think for a long time, there were candidates who may have felt uneasy when they're asked about immigration. So what do we do about the border wall, or what do we do about this? And we want them to feel like they have the tools that they need in order to get out a pro-immigrant message that doesn't alienate voters that they're trying to reach, right? And I think it's different for different candidates because a lot of them are on different journeys themselves, and some of them might be pro-immigrant, but they don't fully support a lot of what other candidates do, and that's fine. Right. So we try to meet candidates where they are and try to provide them guidelines, not necessarily exactly what to say, because I mean, I'll be honest, there's no one message that's going to convince every single voter to vote for pro-immigrant candidates. So I think it's a lot of meeting where they are, understanding what their limitations might be, and trying to find those voters that might turn out for them. And that's kind of what we're focusing on now. And also, I mean, trying to get Donald Trump out of office is a huge, huge priority, which is what we're trying to do as well.
Okay. Now you're a permanent legal resident, but that didn't happen until you were in high school, correct?
I'm a citizen. I'm a U.S. citizen. Right. Yeah, and that happened in high school. That's right.
Okay. Can you tell me what aspects of your life were different, or maybe some things other people wouldn't think about, given you and your family's status up until you and your mom became citizens?
Yeah, that's a great question. So my mom became a citizen when I was, I want to say I might have been like 11 or 12. We had already been at the States at that point for about 6 or 7 years. Mm-hmm. She was already a legal permanent resident, which I became one when I was like around 9. And then I became a citizen when I was around 16 through my mom becoming a citizen. So I'm not sure if that's still something that's in place now, but at least at that point, if your parent became a citizen and you were under the age of 18, the process for you going from legal permanent resident to citizen was easier in the sense that you didn't have to take any exam. All you had to do was take the oath. And that's what I did when I was 16. And my sister, actually, who's 10 years older than me, was born in in El Paso. And then my dad, so she was born a citizen, obviously. And then my dad became a citizen about 10 years ago in 2010. So he was the last one in our family to become a citizen. And in terms of how that changed my life, I think it took me a long time to really understand the impact. Because even at 16, I was a legal permanent resident. If I not that I did, but if I would have wanted to, I could have traveled abroad without a problem. So I wasn't limited in that capacity. But I wasn't 18 yet, so then I couldn't vote, even if I was a citizen by the time I became one. But then when I applied to do the Peace Corps when I was 22, one of their requirements back then, I think they've changed it since then, was that you had to be a U.S. citizen, right? So for me, being a citizen actually allowed me to fulfill a goal of mine, which was to be a Peace Corps volunteer, which I would not have been able to do without, that sheet of paper that made me a citizen. So one of the most formative experiences of my life were those 2 years and 3 months that I spent in Costa Rica. So being a citizen actually allowed me to do that.
And just because for my own ignorance, so like the difference, like, or the transition from legal permanent resident to citizen was what?
And in terms of years,
No, in terms of like, what is the process or what's the difference? Because like some people hear legal permanent resident and think that that means you're a citizen, and that clearly is not the case.
well, no, if you're an LPR or a legal permanent resident, you're still technically a citizen of another country,
Okay.
but you are allowed to reside permanently in the United States. Essentially, you do have to continue renewing it after a certain
Right.
amount of time, and you can still be deported essentially, even if you're a legal permanent resident. So being a legal permanent resident is pretty much being on a pathway to citizenship. A lot of folks kind of stay in that LPR status for many reasons. I think for a lot of them, it's cost prohibitive to become a citizen. It's incredibly costly. You have to go through lawyers. You have to file so many fees. So it's not cheap to become a citizen. Also, a lot of folks, to be honest, probably don't necessarily see the importance of becoming a citizen if they're already able to work here legally and travel to their countries of origin or abroad. Because if you're a legal permanent resident and you don't want to spend the money and you're fine with just being able to work here, which is fine. I mean, I don't knock them, but they don't necessarily see that next step as being one that's being necessary of becoming a citizen. Obviously, the number one thing that you can do when you're a citizen is vote. So anyone who is a legal permanent resident and they're able to become a citizen, I would still highly encourage them to do so for that right. Because if you're a legal permanent resident and you're living here in the U.S., what's happening around you is still affecting you, right? Whether that's taxes, whether that's your children's schools, whatever issues might be happening around you locally. If you're a legal permanent resident, and even if you're undocumented, obviously for undocumented folks, there's no pathway now, but at least for LPRs, there is a chance for you to become a citizen and actually start voting or start running for office too. So there are ways to get more engaged if you do become a citizen. But I think for a lot of folks, they just don't necessarily see that next step as being one that's essential just yet.
Okay. Now, currently you and your wife live in Austin, and your wife is a DACA recipient, correct?
That's correct, yeah.
What are some challenges that come with being a DACA recipient in terms of like working, going to college, life events like getting married, buying a home, and different things like that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there are many. I won't speak for her, but just from like stories that she's shared with me and stories that I've heard from other DACA recipients, even though DACA recipients are able to technically work legally in the country, even when the program was first announced, which was in 2012, so it's been about 8 years now, it took a while for employers to actually understand what the program did and what it allowed people to do, right? So I think when people started applying for jobs, folks who were employers, they're like, I don't know what DACA is. And you only have this permit that allows you to stay here for 2 years. And then what happens after those 2 years, right? So I think initially it was having DACA become something that was understood to allow folks to work legally, I think was a big challenge. Now at this point, I think we're at a level of understanding across the country that folks with DACA are allowed to work legally. But I think the challenges remain, right? So it's still only a 2-year program. So every 2 years you have to renew so that you can keep your employment or not lose your house or whatever that might be, right? Because if folks fall out of status, if they're not able to renew, then you might lose your job security, right? You might not be able to work. And if you've purchased a home or if you've helped your parents purchase a home, then that might actually make it a lot more difficult, right? You also, at least now, you're not able to. Before, when President Obama announced DACA, they allowed what was known as advanced parole, which was something that you as a DACA recipient could use or apply for that would allow you to leave the country for one of 3 reasons, which I might not remember them all. I know it was like humanitarian, like job related, or like educational. So a lot of folks, when DACA was first introduced, used advanced parole that allowed them to go back to their countries of origin, either to like visit family or pay respects to a family member who might be passing away or who's passed away, right? So I think the discretion was pretty broad back then in terms of what the government allowed folks to travel back to their countries of origin for. And it also wasn't necessarily countries of origin. Like if you wanted to take advantage of an educational program that was in a different country, you could do that too. But now advanced parole after President Trump ended DACA officially ended DACA in September of 2017, they also ended advanced parole. So now DACA recipients aren't allowed to leave the country at all, at least not if they want to come back, right? So if they were to leave the country, then they would not be able to come back. And I think another challenge is also that their parents, for the most part, a lot of them don't have status now either, right? So you have a situation now where you might have a DACA recipient child and whose parents are still fully undocumented. So there's this understanding from DACA recipients that they know that they have a sense of privilege within the undocumented community, that they're allowed to work legally, but they also understand that it's not nearly enough of what needs to be done, right? So like, what good does it do if they can work legally, but their parents are still scraping by? And I mean, I feel like for a lot of folks, they've had those tough conversations about what it means to be a DACA recipient, but still having their parents be undocumented. But it's tough, right? Because I think if you ask a lot of undocumented parents, they'd be like, do everything you can to help my children and make sure that they're able to like succeed in this country, because that's what a lot of them came for initially, right? So it is a tough conversation to have in that sense too, is that parents remain undocumented, other family members remain undocumented. And it's a program that, as we've seen, it can be ended. And I think what the Supreme Court did was not necessarily rule on the merits of whether or not DACA was lawful or not. We believe it is and continues to be within the discretion of the presidency. We also believe that Trump probably does have the authority to end the program, but we also believe that the court decided correctly in not, just understanding the impact that it would have not only on DACA recipients, but on the country and the economy as a whole. So if you look at the ruling, it kind of explains it that way. But I also know that it's not going to stop Trump, or it's not going to stop Stephen Miller, who really is the mastermind behind of a lot of his immigration policies, from doing whatever they can to end the program. So I think it's a lot of that uncertainty of, even though there was a good decision last week, we still know that Trump's going to continue attacking the program. But overall, I mean, from the countless DACA recipients who I've met, they've spoken so greatly of the program. A lot of them have been able to, as you mentioned, work, purchase homes, purchase cars, plan for their future, right? For like the first time in a long time. So I think number one is that's what DACA has allowed young folks to do, is really plan for their future, even if it's at 2-year increments.
Right. One thing I've been talking to my students about just in general is that, like, when you're in a leadership position, you should be considering your employees and team members, not just as like your employees and team members, but considering their life outside of work, given that you're especially sometimes spending more time with them than they would with their families. Part of that is understanding their identity. And for a lot of folks in this course, this is the first time they might have been aware of what it means to be in a mixed status household. And I know you're in one right now. So can you describe some of the emotional, I know you kind of talked about it a little bit in what you just said, but can you describe a little bit some of the emotional and kind of like psychological challenges that come with that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there are many, right? I feel like number one, for me as the citizen, I always feel like a sense of uncertainty that something could happen that leads to my wife being deported, right? Because even though she has deferred action, that still doesn't fully protect her from deportation. It's like something that provides layers of protection, but not full-blown protection like being a citizen, right? So I think number one is I still have that fear in the back of my mind that something could happen and we could have our lives entirely upended, right? And go completely away. And
sorry, can you start that off? You froze for a second. Can you start that question over?
Yeah. No, in terms of DACA, if that program were to completely go away and God forbid Angie loses her work permit, right? So then what are we going to do about like her employment and her job, and to ensure that we have like the security that we need here? And if in our case is denied, what decisions do we have to make, right? So we have to have conversations that it's unlikely that many married couples have to have, right? Like it's almost like a checklist of what we would do in worst case scenario of her being deported. And then, do I move back to Mexico? I haven't lived there since I was 5 years old. What would that be like? I mean, I speak Spanish, but I wouldn't say I speak it at a level that would allow me to be a professional in the country, right? So these are conversations that we have to have. And these are also like the points that we have to make to the people who would be adjudicating our case, right? So they're the ones at USCIS that will be looking at all our information and saying like, all right, so Mario is a citizen. He has this job and he's done this, and this is his wife, and they've done this together. What would it mean if she wasn't allowed to stay, right? And they take everything into account, like all those factors. So there's a lot to keep in mind there. And also, like, we can't travel to Mexico. I mean, I could travel to Mexico, but Angie could not, right? And I wouldn't feel right going somewhere abroad like that without my wife, because she hasn't had the chance to see family members in a very, very long time, right? Which is another thing that for mixed status families is a little bit different in terms of what we're able to do traveling wise. So there's a lot to keep in mind. Like, purchasing a house is a little trickier. We purchased a home recently, and the lender we were going through, I think she might have heard of DACA, but kept telling us that she'd prefer if we didn't have a DACA recipient on our loan, just because she didn't know the future of the program. Thankfully, we didn't end up losing it, and we got it, but like, it couldn't be under both of our names. Technically, it had to go under my name only. So there's a lot to consider. I'm sure I'm only scratching the surface, and I guarantee that for other mixed status families, they probably have unique experiences, but those are probably some of the overlapping ones that a lot of us have.
Okay. And the last question I have is for those people in a leadership position who are operating on the U.S.-Mexico border, what advice would you give, given that many leaders will have team members who live in a mixed status home and or maybe undocumented themselves?
I mean, I think number one is be aware and learn as much as you can, and listen to the folks that you are leading and the folks that you employ, right? So I think for a lot of employers, if they hire a DACA recipient, that might be the only DACA recipient that they know, and they don't necessarily know what's going on in their lives, right? So I would encourage anyone, even on the border or not, but especially on the border, because as you mentioned, the likelihood of you interacting with, employing, working with, going to school, having your kids go to school with someone who is undocumented is like learning about that experience, right? And understanding what it is that motivates people to move here in the first place, right? I think, and we've spoken about this before, but I think now in this country, we've done such a disservice and such a demonization of the migrant experience now to saying that movement itself is a crime and that we should criminalize people who try to do this. But I think the more we learn about what it is that motivates people to do this and the challenges that they face, I think hopefully the more open we would be about including them in deeper conversations about how we grow as a company or how we grow as an organization, because I feel like this is not an issue that's going away anytime soon. So I would just encourage anyone in a leadership position to listen to as many voices as they can, so that they can hear as many perspectives as possible.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us and for speaking to my class this week. I appreciate it, Mario.
Yeah, of course. You got it.